Hi friends, welcome and thanks for tuning in to the One Truth Project podcast, where we discuss Islam, its history and theology. We invite you to check out our books and blogs responding to Islamic questions with biblical answers. We offer in-person workshops, consultations, lectures, live Q&As on Islam and Christianity, as well as Bible tours throughout the British Museum. Everything we do points to the Lord Jesus, who we believe is the answer and only solution to the world's problems.
Hello there, I'm Beth Peltola, your host for today's episode, where we'll be asking the big questions of Islam. Joining me is Dr. Jay Smith, an expert in Islamic history. Thanks for joining our conversation. Jay, great to have you here in London. Welcome back. It's been a while. I was remembering a time when there were sometimes about 12 to 13 of us crammed in this office, actually, researching all sorts of topics to do with Islam, even Christian history and Islamic history. And as Christians, we've had a few hundred years or so of people asking, probing questions about Christian history, about our theology, about the divinity of Jesus, the Trinity, and so on. But in the last sort of few decades, or maybe since the 1960s, perhaps even before, and I'll let you tell us when that is, people have begun asking questions of other religions, primarily Islam. And I know this is something that you have, an area you've been studying for many, many years. I'm really excited to hear more of what you want to share about what you and your team have discovered. But before we get there, I was wondering if you could just share a little bit about Fanda Films and what you're doing in the States and what you and your team are focused on.
Yeah, well, Fanda Films was started in 2006, so YouTube began in 2005, so almost immediately. We have some friends, some mutual friends. John came to me back in 2006, and he said at that time there were about 14 to 17,000 videos that were confronting Christianity. And when they wanted to look the other direction... That
was from Muslims.
Muslims. These are all Muslims, all in English, all on YouTube. And then he said, well, how many are confronting Islam? He could only find 14 or 15 versus 14,000. So he said, Jay, there's a real problem here. You're out in the public, so is Beth, so are the others on your team. You're not at all afraid to put your face in front of a camera. Would you be willing to start these videos? I said, yeah, let's do it. And so I went to his house. If you look at the very beginning, back in 2006, I'm sitting on a couch, a very grainy type of film. It was an old camera.
Are they still on your website?
They're still
Can we
there.
See them?
You can still see them. They haven't been taken off.
And it's a YouTube channel primarily.
It's YouTube. Yeah. We've only used YouTube. To begin with, we had very few subscribers because people were just getting used to YouTube. It was so new yet. It really hadn't taken off. But about 2010 then. So we're talking about another 4 years later, we started using and engaging into what we call the historical critique.
Now, explain what that is. Some people may not even know what that means.
Basically, it's asking the same historical questions that you just brought up that were asked of us. Back in 1800s, people like Wellhausen or the Tübingen school, the school in Germany, were asking whether Jesus existed, whether there was Matthew, Mark, Luke, or Paul. How can we know that there was a crucifixion? These are very important questions,
and good questions,
historical questions, and needed to be answered. And so they started applying what we call source criticism, looking at seeing whether or not much of the Bible had been borrowed from other sources. Redacted criticism, seeing whether or not people had written at one stage and put it back to another time period. They started,
a lot of people like to say that about big portions of the Bible, like the book of Daniel or the book of Genesis.
Exactly. Yeah. Or that much of the New Testament was written in the 4th century, redacted back to someone named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
We address some of these questions, don't we, in the Bible tours that we run. You run one in America. I'll have you share a little bit about that. And One Truth runs it at the British Museum and Library. Yeah. And you run a tour at the Bible Museum in Washington.
The Museum of the Bible.
The Museum of the Bible.
Which is a kind of carbon copy of what they've done here, at least the one floor, the 6th floor. And so these are questions that were asked of us 100 years ago, 200 years ago, to be exact, which we were forced to answer. And especially textual criticism, looking at the manuscripts and saying, are these manuscripts, can we date them? Are they correct? Or do they come from the pen of the person that is claimed to be? Have they been redacted? Have they been decreed, decreed? All these questions that are perfectly good questions that have been only asked of the Bible.
And of course, important questions, because how do we understand a religion? That's through its text and through its founder. And so it's through looking at the central person of a religion as well as through the text that we understand what a religion teaches. So those are the two areas that people will ask questions about.
And especially Christianity and Islam, because they both are dependent on a revelation. Islam and Christianity start from that paradigm. They both believe in a revelation. For the Muslims, it's the Quran. For us, it's the Bible. They both believe in a person who founded that religion. For Christians, it would be Jesus Christ. Obviously, that didn't found Christianity, but he is the one that is the model for Christianity. And Islam, it would be Muhammad would be the model for Islam. And they both believe that these men and those books were created at a certain period in time, at a certain place, and with certain actions and stories that follow it. So these are historical claims that both make. And that's why if they make the historical claims, as they both do, we need to answer historically. And that should be asked of every religion, not just Islam and Christianity. We have to ask that of the Upanishads or the Vedas or the Bhagavad Gita or the Granth Sahib for the Sikhs or the Book of Mormons for the Mormons. These are questions that need to be asked of every religion that makes historical claims,
and we have a long history of that within Christianity, all through church history. You've got books right behind you of the church fathers who've written reams of their debates and discussions and theology. And we have this tradition in Christianity where heresies would come up through the church much later on from the end of the 2nd century, say. And the church leaders were responding to these heresies and always saying, nah, that's not what the church has believed. That's not what the texts say. That's not the testimony from the apostles. And so they'd stand against these different other texts that would come up. And so we have a tradition within Christianity of addressing any text that claims to be from God. We'll address it and we'll talk about it and debate it and so on. And so that's in our history. That's in our tradition.
And wouldn't you say, Beth, that Christianity, more so than any other religion, has passed this test because there have been so many questions on that very nature. Because the fact that we do take our scriptures seriously and we do take the person who the scriptures refer to so seriously, we have been held accountable at that point, and more so than any other religion.
Many Christians study it in universities as well. So it's actually a hot topic to study at university.
It is a hot topic. And this is why I love, because of the fact that we've had to pass that test and we've been forced to answer those questions, we're so much further ahead than the rest of the world. We're the only ones that really had been hit with redactic or source or form or textual or historical criticisms, high and low. All of these criticisms applied against the Bible, not created on the Bible, but matured on the Bible. Since we have had to work with it for 200 years, we're so much further ahead of everybody else. Also, since we've answered every one of those criticisms, we have the right, therefore, to ask the same questions of other religions, in case, especially Islam.
I think also just before we go into looking at Islam, I think it's important for us to look at the early church and how the early church not only had to defend the faith and defend the testimony of who Jesus was and what Jesus had done, but also those early texts, which of course before the 4th century were in separate books, weren't they? It wasn't until after the 4th century we begin to see the Bible put into one volume. But before then, they had to defend this faith under persecution. And I love the fact how when you look at the Council of Nicaea, you'll have about 318 church leaders came together. Many of them had torture scars on their body because they had gone through that in defending their faith. So it's a tried and tested religion from the get-go. And so we had to defend it, as you have said. But now we need to turn and start looking at other religions, because if God has communicated and if God wants us to know who he is, then we've got to decide which religion is it, because the religions say vastly different things about who God is. So this is an important question.
And especially for Islam. Muslims have never heard these questions. No one has dared to say, hold on a minute, was there a person named Muhammad? That's just unheard of. Until Robert Spencer came out with his book in 2012. It shocked everybody. It still shocks people today. Or is there a original Quran? How do we know that there was an Uthmanic Quran, what they call the Uthmanic Quran, created by a man named Uthman in 652? These are questions Muslims have never been hit with until now.
And of course, before Robert Spencer, there were others asking, but they tended to keep their research somewhat in the universities. It wasn't out in the public. Perhaps what Robert Spencer's book blew it out and put it into the public.
He put it into layman's terminology, and he also made sure that this was on street level so that we could understand it. And because of that, he's done us a great favor. Now, when that came out in 2012, Robert Spencer didn't have an awful lot of material. we now have so much more material than he had. He had to redo that book. In fact, I was the one that was responsible for him to redo the book. I wrote the foreword in it because even when he did it in 2021, 3 years ago, he still was missing much of the material on the coins, on the inscriptions, and certainly the material that we're going to talk about. This new material has not been put in any book. You're the first to get it. In fact, I've come over here to England to introduce it. So we're going to move into some areas concerning Muhammad himself. And this is the area that I'd like to talk to you about.
So we're going to talk a lot about those coins. We're going to talk about Muhammad. We're going to talk about those texts in sort of 10-minute slots coming up. Just to break it down for people. Anyone can understand. Anyone can access this material.
There we go.
And you are writing a book, I hope. It will go into a book.
It's a book that's going to have to be rewritten and rewritten and rewritten every
But
year.
that's research.
That's the great thing. It's a good problem. I don't mind it.
Super. Thanks, Jay.
Here at the One Truth Project, we care about you and want to support you the best way that we can when it comes to sharing your faith with Muslim friends. If you're in conversation with Muslims and desire to equip yourself with how to confidently share Jesus, we have 2 books that we believe will be great resources for you. A Short Guide to Islam, written by our CEO, Beth Peltola, highlights the primary tenets of the Islamic faith, common misunderstandings the West holds about Islam, and how Christians can best respond and engage with Muslims. Questions to Ask Your Muslim Friends is another book co-written by Beth and Tim Dieppe of Christian Concern. Jesus frequently engaged people with questions, so, seeking to follow this model, both authors suggest a range of questions to use in conversation and provide answers to the responses some of these questions may bring about. Both books are ideal for those who wish to see their Muslim friends impacted by the life-giving power of the gospel. The books encourage Christians to confidently engage their Muslim friends in a serious and meaningful way. These books are available at onetruthproject.org and Amazon.